Hello, welcome back, everybody. Can I begin the second part of our webinar by introducing Julie, Julie Rogers, who is, so amongst our many achievements that are noted down here in the biography I have for picked out a couple. Firstly, responsible for overseeing the development of the first primary care workforce plan for Wales, and work around about an NHS Wales recruitment campaign aimed at recruiting more trainees. So I think especially well prepared to talk about workforce planning, and Julie's going to talk about workforce planning and some of the workforce planning approaches during the pandemic in Wales. So without further ado, Julie, I'll hand over to you and let you give your presentation. Thanks.
Lovely, thank you, Chris. And it is just about good morning. So good morning, everybody. Ellie's kindly offered to do my slides. So while she's just loading those up for me, I just wanted to say, thank you to everybody who's been involved in organising this event today. I've made so many notes so far, and it's always a danger, I think, about going last, that you suddenly think, oh my goodness, have I covered what I need to cover? So I'm going to give you the pitch from Wales, the Wales story, as I see it through my lens. Just a little bit of background as well as we go through in terms of our organisation and the Wales context, because I'm aware we've got a lot of people on the call today, and there may be quite a few of you who don't understand how we're organised in Wales. And just a little bit as well about my background. So I've been blessed recently in securing a permanent role in HPMA as the Workforce Director. Prior to that, I was actually on secondment from the Welsh Government, where I was the NHS Wales Workforce Director. So I've kind of been working alongside health and social care for about 14 years. And prior to going into HR, I was in social care policy. So a lot of the stuff that Pat and Chris and others have been saying this morning about integration of health and care are things that are familiar to me and stuff that I'm passionate about. So maybe at another time when we can all meet in person, we can have a conversation about some of the great ideas that are happening across the UK and how we might be able to land those together. Okay, so moving on to today, workforce planning. I'm going to tell you a bit about our workforce strategy, which is informing our strategic workforce planning approach, and also how we responded to COVID. And some of that will be quite familiar because I think there's a lot of commonality across the UK, but there may be some takeaways for you today that you think, actually, that's quite interesting. I'd like to follow up and learn a bit more about that. So thanks, Ellie. If we could move on then. So next slide is just a very quick overview of our system in Wales. We have 12 organisations and a couple of hosted organisations. So that is a really blessed position to be in. We've got 7 integrated health boards that are responsible for population health needs, and that means that they're required to work with partners, including the care sector, in ensuring that the health needs in their areas are met. We've had those since 2009. You would think by now we'd have cracked it. No disrespect to any of our colleagues or myself, but actually it's not as easy as it sounds. So we've got 7 integrated health boards, we've got 3 All Wales trusts, and then we've got 2 special health authorities in blue, and you can see we're in the middle. And our responsibility is for workforce education, training, transformation, workforce planning. So I'll come on to a bit more about that in a moment. Thanks, Ellie. So in terms of our next slide, this is just to say a little bit of a take home. We use a 6-step model for workforce planning, which I know is used elsewhere in the UK. We are, as I say, the national body. We were set up in 2018. Our sister bodies are in England, Health Education England, and also NES in Scotland, and we've worked closely with colleagues in those organisations as we were setting up 3 years ago. So in Wales, our 7 health boards have responsibility for workforce planning. That's a statutory duty. And so in HIW, our role is not to workforce plan the whole of the NHS, but to actually support them in their statutory functions. So we've got functions such as workforce intelligence, upskilling our workforce planners, actually looking at roles, workforce transformation, and obviously the education and training pipelines, which are so fundamentally important to those. In 2019, about a year after we were established, we were tasked by Welsh Government with developing a workforce strategy for Wales. We did that, as I say, in partnership with Social Care Wales, and for those of you who don't know them, they're a government quango responsibility for regulation, improvement and development of the social care workforce. So we worked really closely together to develop a 10-year strategic workforce strategy for Wales, which covered not only health, but also care. And I was going to say that I think this is the first of its kind, but obviously Chris has told me that you've got one in Scotland, so we're in good company. Okay, if we could move on to the next slide, please. So this is just a quick run through of the political context. The slide there just shows, that our government in Wales want to move us from hospital-based care and treatment to an agenda which is more focused on health, wellbeing and prevention. So this isn't rocket science, this is common across the whole of the UK. I think there's no doubt that the pandemic's had quite a big impact on our ability to move towards that vision as a nation, but it remains the extant vision. On the left, the document with a cute little boy on the front cover is A Healthier Wales, and that was the document that the government published in 2018 that led to the commissioning of the Workforce Strategy for Health and Social Care. And we've just given you a quote there on the slide from that strategy. One of the things that was really interesting about this document was that it covered not just the health and social care agenda, but the contribution of the economy, of employment, of all other sectors to actually making Wales a healthier place. And one of the things in there in relation to the health agenda was that actually it introduced the concept of a quadruple aim. So as well as being focused on improving the quality of care to people, improving population health, there was also an express duty to actually focus on engagement and well-being of the workforce. And this was a fundamental, I think, moment for us in Wales, actually putting that alongside, patient care. And that gave us the mandate for a lot of the work that we've done subsequently. Other policy contexts, obviously we've got Welsh language, that's really important. Our government has introduced targets around numbers of Welsh speaking, as you can imagine, through a workforce planning lens. We've got a conflict between the people who are trying to push the Welsh language agenda, quite rightly, to make sure that patients got access to services in the language of their choice. We've got that against the reality of life, which is that many of our organisations can't get enough nurses and doctors to have safe staffing levels. So, a lot of discussion going on in Wales over the last couple of years and ongoing about quotas around should we have a recruitment target of 10% of all of our nurse recruitment to be Welsh speaking, and that's just not something we can deliver. So a constant real look at how we can not only address the challenges that you're all facing, but also the language issues that we've got in Wales as well. Just other things then briefly on this slide, Nurse Staffing Act we have in Wales. I know we were the first nation to sort of go down that route. Chris has very articulately talked about the Health and Care Staffing Act in Scotland. I wish that we had a staffing act as opposed to a nurse staffing act, because I do think that gives you more scope when you're looking at how you use your workforce, how you develop new roles and have different approaches. So we've got the Nurse Staffing Act, we've had that for 5 or 6 years now. It's focused on adult acute inpatient wards. It's being rolled out to mental health inpatient. We're also looking at paediatrics, health visiting and district nursing. So obviously you can imagine the more that these staffing levels and expectations are put in place in relation to single professions, the more restrictive it is for workforce planners who are thinking creatively about how we might get multidisciplinary teams in place that might do some of the work that perhaps other professionals did previously. So moving on then, thanks Ellie. So my next slide then is just a bit of a teaser on the workforce strategy for health and care. So I've mentioned that in our first year we were tasked with doing this. It won an award last year for which we're extremely grateful, the HPMA UK 2021 award for partnership working. So we're really proud of that. It was genuinely a massive piece of partnership work with our partners across health and social care. Over 1,000 people contacted and engaged in the development of the workforce strategy, the biggest exercise we've ever done in Wales, really, around engagement on workforce. It's got 7 themes in it. As you'll look at them down the left-hand side, they're not rocket science. They're very similar to strategies and documents and the people plan and things across other parts of the UK. There are some Welsh flavours to it if you get into it. If you wanted to go to the HIW website, you'll find the document in full and it's free. So if you want to download it and steal sections of it, then very happy to do so, for you to do so. If you want to have more of a conversation offline about it, then just drop me a message and I'm very happy to discuss it. So that provides really the strategic framework for us as workforce planners in Wales. It sets the context, and underpinning each of these 7 themes are 32 actions over the first 3 years. We're about to go into the closet now and talk about the next set of actions for the next 3 years. We've chunked it up in that sort of way. Within HIW, we're using this, so we've got a couple of pieces of activity at the moment which may be of interest, and you may see that hitting our website and social media. So we're developing a mental health workforce plan. So it's interesting to hear colleagues from Good Shape talking now about mental health of the workforce. That's really important. So we've got a mental health workforce plan coming out on the 1st of February, and we've used the workforce strategy to shape that. We're also looking at developing a nursing plan this year now. And one of the reasons for that is that there is just so much work happening, I think, on nursing workforce, international recruitment, you know, how we learn from the surge exercise that we did last year, that we just feel as though we need to sort of have a coherent map and a plan for what everybody is doing around nursing, so that we can make sure that if there's any gaps there as an organisation, we can support those. But more importantly, that colleagues don't waste time in duplicating stuff that's already happening. So those are some of the things that we're looking at going forward. Thanks, Ellie. In terms of this slide then, so this is stuff that you all know and stuff that we've discussed this morning. You know, we do feel in Wales, I'm sure you feel the same, that, you know, from a workforce perspective, workforce planning perspective, we've just got a perfect storm. There are so many changes and things that are contriving against us. So Pat mentioned earlier, you know, don't count your head count, actually think about your hours. And I have to say, less than full time is something that's really hitting us in Wales. So we can see that, you know, there is this huge desire for people to have more of a balance in their lives. I'm a baby boomer myself, so it was all about getting a good pension and a good career and actually working as hard as you could for 40 years. You know, the people now that are entering our workforce want a different deal, and I see that through my children and my nieces and nephews. So dealing with that is a major issue. And then we've got all the other stuff around, you know, the digital revolution that Pat sort of started to talk to us about today, you know, government across the UK, attitude to immigration, the changing skill set, how do we make sure our staff in our existing workforce have got the right skills. So there's just huge amounts going on that I think, you know, we need to work on collaboratively as a UK country. I think there's a huge benefit in doing that. And so one of the things I was really pleased about today was this event being organised. And I think it just gives us an opportunity to reconnect with colleagues from other parts of the UK and have some insight into what's being done. So perfect storm feels like, you know, absolute nightmare. But thanks, Ellie. It was kind of always a bit like this, I think. So this is a fantastic quote, and I'm happy for these slides to be sort of emailed or made available to colleagues afterwards. But this is an Irene Bevan quote, and I've got a wonderful lady working with me called Clem Price, who is my strategic workforce planning expert and my go-to lady. So she gave this to me and I'd not come across it until recently, and it's absolutely fabulous. I'll leave you read that in your own time, but essentially it's saying that it was pretty pants, technical term, in 1948 too, and that we've had shortages of key professionals for many years. So I think whilst we're thinking about how on earth as workforce planners are we going to sort this out, we need to remember actually that Rome wasn't built on a day and we can't sort this overnight. And to allow ourselves a little bit of slack in terms of we can do our best, but maybe this is one of the things that we live with as a system going forward. Making it better is a good thing. We're not necessarily going to solve it. So that was yesterday. So looking ahead then in terms of the future, what are we dealing with today? Thanks, Ellie. So again, these are headlines from across the UK, issues in Wales as well. Pat and other speakers this morning have talked about it. We're all trying to cope with these things, but it's not just about the shortages in our system. It's actually about competing with Tesco, who might be offering better wages, as we start to think more about across the health and care system. How do we sort of make sure that we're not outpricing the care sector and private sector bodies who are trying to sort of recruit, because without the care sector, quite frankly, the NHS is absolutely up a creek. We see higher numbers in Wales of people who are ready to be discharged but don't have anywhere to go. And that is taking up a lot of our capacity in our hospitals, particularly adult mental health and adult care wards. So how do we actually work together as a system, but not forgetting that we're also competing in hospitality and the other sectors? And part of that is because of the changing demographics. We know, the baby boomer generation is almost done now. It's working its way through the system. As Pat said, it's going to be a demand and a call on the system in years to come. But the birth rate is really low across the UK, and the supply of the workforce, together with people wanting to work differently in the future, means that we've got this perfect storm that we talked about. Thanks, Ellie. So in terms of looking then to COVID, how we've worked in partnership, I'm going to focus here just a little bit on what we did in Wales. And as I said, a lot of this you will have done the same in your parts of the system. But as I said earlier, all NHS organisations in Wales have got statutory responsibility for workforce plan. So the worst thing that we could have done as a national workforce body during COVID would have been to go in there and try and actually, second guess what they were doing, try and nationally workforce plan it all for them. So we really sort of had to think about how could we add value, how could we step up, how could we support them? Because one of our other challenges is that our work is naturally longer term. So we are in that space which is more strategic. We commission the education and training in Wales, but again, with that, what we're looking at is a longer term supply and pipeline of people. So how could we sort of react and respond really quickly without actually, as I say, duplicating or treading on the toes of our health board colleagues? And one of the things that we could see was that they couldn't lift their eyes up. They were so focused on surge capacity, field hospitals, trying to maximise staff, looking at the decisions around which services to turn off, which ones they could risk assess and maybe step back a bit, that we thought actually there were some things that we could do system-wide that might help them. So just to run through those quickly, like all of the national organisations, we've got the others that I showed you on one of that first slides. We diverted our resources and reframed our work. So we started looking at the clinicians we employed. Could we offer those back to the front line? We started looking at some of our work programmes. Could we put those on steroids and roll them out really quickly? We made rapid changes to education and training to minimise the impact on our students and trainees, because whilst we weren't supportive of the deployment of students, because we could see this might be an issue down the line, there was an appetite from our government to redeploy students and trainees. So they got redeployed, and what we did was made sure that they were supported, enabled and facilitated to work in support of the front line. We also developed a range of support resources for trainers and managers to sort of help them work with the redeployed trainees so that they understood clearly what skills and what tasks would be appropriate. Our compassionate leadership work, and I'll come back to this a bit at the end, we put that absolutely on max pace because we could just see that this was really important to making sure that we supported people going through these horrible experiences, and that we had the space where people could have support and an understanding of what compassionate leadership means. We also established a Once in Wales compendium of accessible wellbeing resources and tools. So we curated a lot of that. We've got people together from across the system who weren't involved in frontline, and then we kind of managed to have conversations where we could to see what people would find useful. In addition to that, we worked closely with the Welsh Government, who obviously were setting up, like the UK government, the COBRA and the Gold and the emergency planning arrangements, and we campaigned and secured a workforce cell for Wales that sat underneath those arrangements. And I co-chaired that cell with my counterpart in government. And we did some amazing work in that cell, including, identifying the need for more infection prevention and control training to be rolled out really rapidly. We got people who weren't used to working in ICU and critical care. We gave them additional training really quickly to increase the numbers of people that could be deployed there. We developed a pop-up workforce model and streamlined induction, which would have enabled us to actually support the staffing in the field hospitals. Now, luckily in Wales, we only ended up setting up one field hospital in Cardiff, and that was, we were able to staff that from a call out to arms across the nation. But we did a lot of things that would that could just be drawn down by our local organisations to support them and really take the pain away from some of that kind of work really that they did. And then the other thing that we did, I became a member of the National Vaccine Board for Wales, and so we worked really closely with colleagues leading the vaccine programme rollout, and we developed protocols that allowed us to use non-registrants in Wales, pinching some of the training from England around how you actually train people to be vaccinators, but really looked at those things. So, so those are the things that we did in support. From a workforce, next slide, sorry, Ellie. From a workforce planning perspective then, the other thing that we did was we could see that people were really struggling, saying, how do I workforce plan, in a COVID scenario, what does that look like? And 7 organisations trying to do it differently. So we got together a group of brilliant people, including my lovely Clem, to actually see how we might actually set some principles in place really quickly and rapidly, with agreement that people in local organisations could use. And we developed and produced these, got them published, and they really helped local organisations just frame the work they were doing. Again, they're on the slide, a bit small there, but available on our website. And so, we also, to support that then, developed some accessible online resources, including a compendium of workforce guidance. So what was happening in other organisations? People didn't have time to tell each other. So we acted as a conduit, pulled that all together and just made it available. We also helped manage the noise from the trade union partners, and I mean that in a respectful way. Naturally, the trade unions were really anxious about the speed at which some of these decisions were being made around workforce deployment, about using students, about using volunteers, about the registrants coming back. So we actually worked collaboratively with our Welsh Government counterparts to say, let's make sure the unions are fully briefed, and let's take some of that sort of engagement and dialogue away from local organisations so that they can focus on planning the workforce and deploying the workforce. And then we also did things like offering weekly workforce planning, drop-in sessions to support the planners who were really having to do this at such a crazy, crazy pace. And that just also, as well as giving them support, gave them dedicated space and a safe space to actually talk about how they were coping and their own well-being. Thanks, Ellie. So this slide just shows you some of the things that we've done as HIW, partly in response to COVID, but also in response to sort of what we've identified as the need. And these are areas, I think, probably happening elsewhere, but when you get into the detail of them, there may be merit in, as a sort of a UK workforce planning community, sort of having some discussions separately, follow-up discussions around these, just to see if we could compare and share. Thanks, Ellie. In terms of where we're next, so I had a list, which is on this slide, of some of the things that we're committed to doing in our own plan for next year. But obviously, I've made loads of notes from this morning, so I think I'm going to steal with pride some of the other ideas from across the UK. So we've got our route map, we've got our workforce strategy. That's a 10-year vision. We're in year 2 now. We're starting to plan for year 3. The pandemic, there's lots of learning from that. There's lots of things we wouldn't do. So we would absolutely die in the ditch over not redeploying students and trainees next time. I think using them as bank or agency workers is fine. I think actually disrupting the pipeline is going to have consequences a couple of years from now, where people have perhaps not qualified when we expected them to, or their studies have been disrupted. Some of our student nurse feedback was not so positive, where they felt as though they didn't really get what they needed out of their placements. So lots of learning from the pandemic, which is really important. The way that we use registrants didn't really work really well. So if we're planning in the future to see registrants as, surge capacity, we need to think about how we warm them, keep them on a pool, keep them sort of informed, because there were lots of really great people coming back out of the woodwork to offer their services, but quite often, they were saying, well, I can do 2 hours, I can't do frontline because I'm, in a shielding capacity. So there was limited use. And then those who were coming back, who hadn't maintained their registration, actually the amount of time to convert them back to being sort of current registrants was really problematic. So I think for us there's some stuff to do with the professional bodies to make sure we can re-register them safely, but in times of needs, how might we do that in a more streamlined, agile way, rather than the sort of peacetime way, which is a little bit longer. I think the other things for us is looking at how we invest in skills and capacity. One of the speakers this morning talked about growing what I would see as the non-specialist workforce planning people. So how do we give everybody involved in planning services, or actually leading services, or in the workforce community, how do we give them some basic workforce planning skills and knowledge so they can do some of this stuff for themselves? And how do we upskill our experts to be the best they can possibly be? So we're thinking about accreditation and education. So I was quite interested in what colleagues said about that, really looking at how we can value, I suppose, as well, the colleagues who are those experts, to make sure that they are supported and that we retain them, because we have a growing need for expert workforce planners. And also then, I think just looking at, the governance around this, pandemic has shone a massive spotlight on workforce planning and workforce more generally. So let's not forget about that. Let's not go back into the back room and actually just do our thing quietly. Let's see how we can actually promote this as a good career to have, and as a specialist element of our workforce and OD community. So those are some of the things that we're thinking about. We're definitely going to follow up some of the conversations from what people have said this morning. And I know that some of my team are going to be meeting with colleagues in Scotland to talk about some of the work that we're doing, and that's already in the diary. So next slide, please, Ellie. I'm just almost at an end now. So COVID workforce impact. Obviously we're, using language like reset and recovery. I think language is similar in other parts of the UK. I don't think we can underestimate how damaged our staff are, and getting them to step back up for Omicron at a time when we've already got, significant workforce pressures anyway with the winter time. We've got to pay attention to how staff are feeling and make sure that we actually do that for quite a long time. So we're looking at how we have equitable access to occupational health, because picking up on what Colin said, from Good Shape, we have got big backlogs in occupational health referrals in Wales. PTSD is a massive concern. We are looking at people, wanting to leave our professions. So our nursing numbers have gone up from 2015 to 2021 by 8% in Wales, but is that enough? No, it's not enough. Can't tell you that scientifically, because our workforce data, which is one of the things I skipped over, is another area that we're starting to pay attention to, because again, that's not great across health, but across health and care, it's pretty poor. It's pretty poor, to be honest. So one of our ways that we're thinking of actually looking at how we recover, I mentioned compassionate and collective earlier on, and we are really blessed in Wales with 12 organisations and a couple of hosted bodies that we work with. We can get all 12 workforce directors, myself included, around a table and agree to do things once for Wales. And we do have a mandate across the whole system with government support and funding to roll out the wonderful Michael West's work on compassionate and collective leadership, and we're doing that at pace in Wales. And that is taking us into those discussions about how we create cultures that people want to work in, how compassionate approaches can support staff recovery and reset, but also importantly, it's underpinned by massive evidence base over many, many years, which tells us that if we get it right for staff, we'll also get it right for patients. So I am part of a 5 Nations community of practice around compassionate and collective leadership. And I'd be really keen to share with colleagues afterwards if anybody's interested in following up on that. But also I think there's a huge opportunity for us to actually look at workforce planning, how we support our staff on a 4 or 5 Nations basis too. So that's it from me. Last slide, Ellie. Thank you for listening today. Sorry if that's been really rapid, but I didn't want to take out time for questions and discussion. And I hope you found that insight into the corner of the UK called Wales helpful. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much, Julie. We've probably got a bit of flexibility now that we've got the end of the webinar really to engage in some conversations. I know we have 3 questions for you. I just wanted to ask you, I don't know whether or not it's a question, but it's around about your aspiration about increasing workforce planning capability across Wales, because obviously we highlighted something similar from Scotland, and you specifically referenced that. How do we train people who are not necessarily specialist workforce planners? And that's something that we've been looking at as well. There aren't ever really going to be a huge cohort of workforce planners across the UK. It's always going to be a relatively small specialism, although taking on board that everybody, line managers should be heavily involved in this. There used to be the postgraduate certificate in strategic health and social care workforce planning that ran out of Thames Valley University, a course which is now ceased. But postgraduate certificate with the appropriate cap points. I know they ran a separate course for colleagues in Northern Ireland around about that. So I just wondered what your thoughts were. Is this something that across the UK we could collaborate with in terms of actually developing something, some sort of educational qualification? Because it looks as if that's the kind of area that you're looking into as well.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Completely agree, and would be really interested in doing this across the UK. So we have been rolling out training for a number of years through Skills for Health, and when HIW, that predates HIW coming alive in 2018, but since then we've been doing a little bit more in-house and establishing networks. So some of this is aspirational in terms of looking forward. So what's the next step? We think in a way we've kind of reached quite a lot of people. So if I talk about the workforce community as first. So one of the things we've got within the remit of the organisation, because as I was leaving government, I was very naughty and I slipped it into our legal instruments. So we've got a statutory responsibility to develop the workforce and OD profession, which puts us in a fantastic position, and it gives me the opportunity to sort of really kind of lead and support that with my colleagues across Wales. So we're looking at the workforce and OD profession through a number of lenses. Actually, what do we need? What skills do we need for the future? How do we actually learn from other parts of the UK? What are the professional strands? And workforce planning is definitely one of the areas we've identified as a specialist area, but also then looking at the broader workforce community. How do we perhaps work with HPMA and CIBD and others to actually really get our other staff up to speed on, the basic fundamentals of workforce planning across the piece? So that's the easy bit. I think just making other people aware. So we're testing it out in our organisation. So I've got nursing workforce leads who actually have got clinical backgrounds who've come in, and we're working alongside them to help them do the workforce planning for their areas or their specialties. We're not actually doing it for them. So we're testing that, and that would be the sort of thing that we want to be doing. But definitely education, accreditation, UK-based approach, it doesn't make sense to do it separately. So very up for that.
And it seems to be that we're possibly in the same circumstance across the UK, because there's a commitment within the integrated health and social care workforce plan in Scotland to increase workforce planning capacity. I'm mindful of the recently published review of HR and OD in England that has recommendations, and I think recommendations around about 32 to 34 were around about increases in and improvements in workforce planning capacity and capability, as well, with the potential for some resource to be aligned to that. So it seems to be as if all of the nations across the UK are looking at this. It doesn't make an awful lot of sense to do it independently if we can pull together our resources. So probably that answers one of the first questions that we're actually going to pose for the rest of the webinar about, you know, how do we cooperate and collaborate across the UK. Hello. Hello there. Is it Jenny? Jenny McClement?
It is. Hi. Sorry, it's so dark here. I'm a 5-hour time difference. So apologies. Okay, I was up at 5 this morning to join this webinar. Hi, Julie.
Commitment for you, Jenny.
I and lower my hand as well. My question now really is, I'm going back into workforce and development, start on the 1st of February with Powell Dda in Wales. So,
oh wow, congratulations.
Okay. But I've been doing some reading around Lucy Adams and HR Disrupted and Agile human resources. And I just want to know, in terms of Agile HR practices, what do you plan to implement so that we can see that difference within Powell Dda? And how will it pan out, really? How will you prepare us as workforce advisors and professionals to be able to be agile?
Yeah, thanks for that question. That's really good. So we are looking at a range of things, including agile. And I think, as Chris just said, you know, we've just had the report published in England as well. I know Prima Ishara has spoken at quite a number of HPMA events about you know, the future of the profession and how it looks going forward. So at the moment we're in the stage of sort of combining all of those things, doing the diagnostic work around what we think the future profession needs to look like. Now we have got a Workforce and OD network. So we've got a portal which is hosted in HIW called Gwella, which is a leadership network that feeds all of our different professional groups and there's development of the workforce and OD profession. So I'm happy to send you some information around that. So you can see there's a huge amount of resources available to you and connect you in with the work as well. So we should be, so we've got the network set up. We should be coming out with an active offer, I think, in about a month's time to the community, just to give you a bit more information. There has been some early work, which you've probably missed in terms of surveys, but there should be a communication coming out in about a month. So there'll be more information on that. But we are looking at everything, just to try and learn the best from everywhere. And I think, for me, all of these different approaches have got the same ingredients, perhaps different labels and a slightly different spin. So yeah, that's where we're at the moment, Jenny.
Brilliant. Look forward to receiving something. Thank you.
Thank you. Picking up some just a comment in the chat from Michelle around about Working Greentip Manchester around train the trainer approaches to training, presumably sort of service managers and workforce planning, and that's an approach that's been used historically. I sit with, in fact, I'm going to grab. I sit with that. This is how committed I am. I sit with my train the trainer approach to workforce planning beside me at all points. So this was something that was developed 10 years ago between NHS Scotland and Skills for Health. It's the kind of thing that looks to me as if we could cooperate around about getting a UK model, because as has been pointed out and by many of the speakers and contributors today, we look as if we're all in the same kind of boat and similar problems. Ellie, can I get you to put up the questions for the rest of the session? So we have 3 questions. The first of these questions is, how can we as workforce planners network better across the 4 nations? How can we stop this approach to developing workforce plans in silos, encouraging more collaboration, since a lot of the problems that we have are so similar? That's the first question. Second question I'm going to read out anyway, which is shape of the workforce and how do we break the cycle and stop chasing skills? So maybe go back to some of those OECD graphs around about training the workforce, recruiting foreign workforces, and look towards about training our own, particularly with reference to some of the points that Pat was making around about potentially we've got very different ways of actually delivering services in the future, and the need for a different workforce. It's not going to look the same. And the third and final question is around about the kind of how do we transition for this idea about short-term focus into a more strategic approach to workforce planning, because I would contend, I'm sure most of you would probably agree that the surge recruitment and the kind of actions that I briefly referenced that Julie talked about, again, it's not necessarily workforce planning. It's an operational response to an immediate problem rather than a considered workforce planning approach to longer term need. So the three questions are there. I'll open it up to those on the call. Please feel free to switch on your audio and video and ask, make comment on any of these three questions, or if you specifically have a question for any of the presenters today on something that you haven't been able to raise because of time constraints, then feel free to do it. So I'll open up. Maybe just as you're thinking, I'll pose a first question which occurs to me as I'm looking at it, and I don't know if Pat's still on the call, but particularly around the development of ICSs. So in Scotland, we have had what we refer to as health and social care partnerships, which is this kind of integrated organisation that deals with both NHS and local authority staff in the delivery of care services across both health and social care. We've had those since 2015. I know that Northern Ireland have had an integrated health and care service for even longer than that. So, Pat, what if you're there, what do you think we can learn from each other around about that? What do you think ICS is going to require in terms of workforce development?
Hello, Chris. Yes, I'm on the call. I've worked in all the countries actually, and so I've seen what the words mean in reality, and it's my impression that there are different degrees of understanding what a partnership means between the four countries. The ICSs for the English seek to create, if you will, a little bit more of the group board structures that you'd have in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. But in terms of locating workforce planning, in terms of the research, development of the metrics, doing the investment papers, working with, in my case, Treasury, for, multi-billion investment programs over 20 years in a genomics workforce or an engineer's workforce, clinical engineering, or change in surgical training, those sorts of things. I think the four countries are nowhere near the partnership working that's required for that work. And I have done 7 national reviews. I'm retired now, but I've done 7 national reviews. They all say the same thing. And it is, in my view, and it's based on many years of experience, unrealistic to expect the boards and the ICSs to develop quickly, if at all, the kind of workforce modelling skills, understanding the metrics, writing investment papers for investment boards, the Treasury, for instance. It's a very complex thing. So therefore, I think we've got to develop a model that uses the boards and the ICSs in England to in some way develop the information base, the informatics base, and the local cybernetics base, so that actually each local sort of region, geography, yields something realistic and meaningful, and that it is the workforce plan is actually connected to the service plan and to the financial plan, and that I've recommended this seven times, several of you will know it, it's never come to pass. If you will, almost a research group that brings together all the papers and synthesizes them, looks at the options, and actually has a professional modeling crew who understand how to make the algorithms and the metrics and produce all the option appraisals that investors like the Treasury need. And I was going to illustrate that with the very, very briefly with the cardiovascular example, but I didn't get to it, ran out of time. But there are things we can do with the local infrastructures, but I think it's too much of a stretch to think that actually we'll get into we'll probably do some quite good supply side modelling, but on the demand side, it's pretty poor. And I also have spent so many years trying to connect the HR supply side informatics with the finance teams and the planning teams. And there is a complete disconnect between HR metrics and those two. So I think this next set of reorganisations hopefully might in some way create the bridges between finance planning and workforce planning, and hopefully develop. So Julie, one of the things we'll do in Wales in the course I'm going to run for you is explore what does your unit become in terms of that synthetic body and the development of expertise locally, but how you relate to the boards across Wales and create the correct role for you as the national centre. What does that look like? Where you've got to develop some legs, basically, and connect with the government in Wales, who are the awarding body for the finances. And I think we can do that. It's not going to happen overnight, but I think certainly for Wales and what Julie's doing, you know, we can migrate there. I think we're going to get a plan together, aren't we, Julie?
Yeah, absolutely. Looking forward to it.
Yes. As for the English, you know, there are so many complicated reorganisations going layer by layer by layer. I think it'll be just a little while coming. And we've got HEE at the moment. Of course, that's going to be bundled into NHS E and I, which is also handling all NHS data mergers, plus the development of ICSs and the social care reforms. I just think there's so much on the plates of top people for the English. It'll be a little while coming. I think you've probably got a shot at it in Northern Ireland and Scotland, because you're on the same kind of trajectory as Julie is for the Welsh, but I think it's going to be a bit different in England.
Yeah, just to pick up, I think I referred to the kind of holy grail of service financial and workforce planning, and it's a similar issue that we've had over the, well, many decades actually. Service plans really not engaging with the relevant workforce implications of changes. Now, actually, we've made some progress in that area in Scotland across the last maybe year. In particular, our NHS and boards in Scotland have been asked to develop recovery plans. And from the Scottish Government perspective, we'll be speaking to colleagues in service planning. And I talked very briefly about aligning the planning cycles, making sure it used to be that, the deadlines in the planning cycles all fell at different parts of the year. So therefore it was difficult to link them together. But what we've done is we've aligned the service planning and the workforce planning timescale. Financial slightly different in that it tends to be set around financial years. But what we are asking NHS boards when we send out advice in terms of developing plans, particularly the service plans, that then the service plans the actions within the service plan then fall out into the workforce plans and the workforce implications of what's in the service, and what we call the recovery plans, is actually articulated in a workforce plan. Okay, what do you need in terms of your workforce to actually achieve what you're putting in the recovery plan and your service plans? How likely is it that you're going to get it? How are you going to get it? So we're trying to make sure that the service actions very clearly align to the workforce actions. Again, you see, it's in the early stages. We're always trying to tease it out to organisations to do that, but we're starting to make some kind of progress in it.
Actually, Chris, can I just jump in there, because Claire Hines has just put something in the chat room which I think is very good. We've got developments for the English, the HEE. I've just seen a note come up of the clinically led workforce activity redesign. That's good. Greater Manchester have developed a local system. These are all really, really good developments, because they stimulate interest locally. They get people thinking in the right space, and that's good. But if I could just make the comment, so I've worked, for instance, on the national genomics strategy and what the genomics workforce starts to look like. And we had to do that from scratch and put the Treasury paper together, and then commission the postgrad programme, which went to the National School in Birmingham, and those graduates now coming out, etc. I mean, it's 10-year lead time on that. What I see, and I've just done something very similar looking at the technology in cardiovascular and development of high street diagnostics, and what does that do to cardiovascular design centres and roller surgeons, roller cardiovascular specialists and the cardio technicians. And so I work at all the levels, and what I see, I like the idea that we've got things happening locally, like the Greater Manchester thing. What I see is a disconnect between that and what's going on nationally with the, if you like, the research boards dealing directly with the Treasury, looking at these very big changes. I mean, it was when I worked on the genomics, it was all done by specialist groups. So how would Manchester and their developments link with that? And it's sort of like, I think there's a series of disconnects that we've got to sort of reveal and then work on to create some bridgeheads. But actually having lots of local interest and starting the ball rolling is a very good thing. It creates an orientation and some interest. And then it's for the, if you like, national level to get its act together. I mean, they do some quite good things at the national level. It's just how do you make the connections, I think. I'll be writing about this, by the way, if I haven't got permission yet, but I have asked for permission to write about this as a strategic issue. And I was hoping to go into the BMJ on it, but maybe sometime this spring and summer, just depends on permissions. Thank you, Colin.
Thanks, Pat. There's a question in the chat that I've missed. I just want to read it out to you. It might be one for you, Pat, because from Takura, it says, does the panel have any thoughts or comments on the use of the HEE clinically led workforce and activity redesign (brackets clear) approach to workforce planning? So I think that must be specifically given its HE English approach, because I haven't heard of it. So therefore my thoughts are limited on it, I have to say. But Pat, you may be in a better position to actually to talk about that.
Yes, it's a good point, and it connects to my point just made that all these developments, like Clear, like what Manchester have got, and several other sort of localities have been developing bottom-up approaches. It's stimulating an interest in workforce data, information, starting to think about the informatics strategy and starting to think about how it's pulled together. So good first start. Question is, how do we lift the game so that we connect these developments to local planning and finance? I do the conferences, particularly on the finance director's strategic investment programs. And they're orientated to this. This is great, but they don't see the workforce stuff as kind of like connected with them. And I think there is a bridge that needs to be built. And I think both, like finance and the planners and HR, have to in some way build the bridges towards each other. It's not for one party to build to the other. I think that, but the politics and the power are that it's with finance and with the planners, is for HR to really start to think about reaching out for them and linking up. But local developments are all to be encouraged and very good. Don't forget, you've got Royal Colleges in here as well, though. They are really important, and that's why I think you need a national unit of something. So something like Julie's, what she's got in Wales, that actually has the power and connection to work directly with the Royal Colleges, is probably going to be quite important.
I don't know, Julie, do you want to pick up on that in terms of your experience about maybe how that functions? Obviously not. Don't think so. Maybe. All right. Okay. Are there any questions? I'm picking up questions from the chat function there. But does anybody want to come on screen and actually ask anything in relation to this? I suppose maybe I can pose a question, and I don't know what the kind of spread of experience is in terms of workforce planning on the call, whether you are mainly workforce planners, mainly HR practitioners with an interest in workforce planning. So I wonder what your thoughts are around about this aspiration for more training, more capacity, more capability training in terms of workforce planning. Is that something that would be welcomed across the community?
Apologies, Chris, it's Julie. I was really struggling with my technology. I was typing a comment in the chat bar and I couldn't get out of chat to come back onto the screen. And then I lost you altogether. I could just hear you. So I do apologise about that. Yeah, I mean, just in terms of Wales, we've had legislation since 2014 requiring us to produce integrated plans that link together service, finance and workforce. And I would say that the least developed area in those plans is the workforce plans. And quite often, despite the legislation, finance does dominate, because at the end of the day, they have to be financially balanced plans. And so that is the bottom line that they look at when it goes into government. So that's the kind of system. I think obviously working as we are in Wales, we've got a close relationship with professional bodies. I think we've got some more OD work to do with government and with some of the other national organisations to make sure we're not doing the same stuff. So we have an entity in Wales called Improvement Cymru, whose focus is around quality, but often strays into leadership in other areas. So as much as we've got a mandate around compassionate leadership, there is that duplication. So, but we do have the benefits of being a smaller system, and it is easy to get 12 people in a room to have a conversation and to sort of just say, why are we wasting time duplicating? So, hopefully we can learn from others, but also perhaps progress some things in Wales that can be then scaled up and shared. In terms of your question about the community of practice and collaboration, those sorts of things, I mean, obviously I gate crashed in December 2018, a community of practice that Michael West and some other lovely people in HE had established around compassionate and collective leadership. And that for us has been a real lifesaver, because it has enabled us to sort of go from a baseline of 0, where we didn't really know what we were doing around leadership, to a place now where other people are coming to have a look at what we're doing in Wales. So I would suggest that for us, this is maybe quite a practical thing, which is how do we get people together to form a community of practice. We meet about 3 times a year, and we take it in turns to organise it. It's virtual now rather than physical, but that sort of willingness for people to engage, I think, is so important.
Julie, I may be putting you on the spot here, and apologies if I am, but one of your colleagues visited the Scottish Government, maybe a couple of years ago, and was talking about some of the training and education opportunities that there were in Wales, and I think based out of HEIW, particularly for service planning and structured for service planning. So don't know if you're aware of that. It might not be within your remit, but I wonder what your thoughts are. Obviously, from your presentation, you've talked about you know, a 3-year plan to improve workforce planning capability. You know, are there any? What are your thoughts in that area? You know, we've had some thoughts in Scotland that I can sort of express, but I'll give you I'll give you first shot at it if you want.
Okay, yeah. So for my sins, in the first year of HIW, we didn't have a director of planning, so I had that gig as well. And so I worked with the 12 directors of planning across NHS Wales and really got an insight into their communities. There's a couple of things we've got in place. On the Gwetla Leadership Portal I talked about earlier on, we've got a network there for all of our directors and assistant directors of planning, and that's where they sort of share best practice. We're also trying to point them towards resources that would support their own personal development. They don't do CPD, so we've tried to influence actually what CPD would look like for them. But in addition to that, across the planning community in Wales, the service planning community, we've also got a government funded programme where we're looking at developing skills and capability to support the integrated planning agenda. So that's where we're at the moment. That is run with one of our universities, and each organisation gets a set number of places every year. And then in relation to financial planning, and as I'm talking now, this is obviously, you know, I've talked about workforce, I've talked about service, and now I'm going to talk about finance. There's more to do to bring the three together. But we've got a finance academy in Wales, which is looking at the development of the finance profession, and that includes a sort of planning element there as well. So there's quite a bit happening, but there's nothing, I suppose, that does integrated training for planning at the moment. The nearest would be the national programme for the planners.
Okay, there's a comment in the chat box from Sam that talks about that highlights a lack of accredited training across the UK in terms of workforce planning, and it's something that I think we've been looking at and we recognise as well that there doesn't seem to be an awful lot out there for workforce planners. I've referenced there used to be the postgraduate certificate at Thames, which was run out of Thames Valley University. Some of you will remember it. Some of you, i.e. me, are old enough to have actually done it. But that's gone a fabulous example of workforce planning. The Deirdre Kelly Patterson, who actually ran that, retired and wasn't replaced. So I'm not necessarily, you know, criticising their own succession planning approach, but don't practice what they preach. So the only place that the Scottish Government have found when we were looking at is there's Carlow Institute of Technology in the Republic of Ireland, who have actually, as part of a governmental commitment in one of their, not workforce plans, but governmental plans, there was a commitment to running and developing a workforce planning course. So we've been engaging with them around about whether or not we can pick up some of their course content with a strategic partner in Scotland, run it on a modular basis where there was almost like cap points, 4 modules, which would give you cap points for a full postgraduate certificate, but also had the flexibility for people to do individual modules. And I'm thinking more here about our discussion around about service managers not necessarily needing all the training in workforce planning, but maybe just elements of it. So you know, our initial thoughts are some sort of development of a modular course that can be flexible enough to meet the needs of specialist workforce planners, but also provide some sort of modules with generic skills for those people who have an interest but not necessarily a specialist interest in workforce planning. So I think that's maybe an area that we can all discuss. I might be in contact with you, Julie, and colleagues across Northern Ireland and in England to discuss that. I am conscious that we are fast approaching 1 o'clock, and we have a hard deadline of 1 o'clock in terms of the end of this webinar. So it will cut off. So I think I'll spend the last few minutes, if I can, just thanking Pat, thanking Colm and Suzanne and Julie for their input today. It's been interesting. I think we highlight that workforce planning is significantly important. Our discussion today is showing that the pandemic has displayed exactly how important workforce planning will be going forward. We know that there's certainly snippets of work that are going on across the four. Snippets is maybe not the best way to describe it, but there's activity going across the four nations in terms of trying to develop workforce planning ability, workforce planning capacity, and introduce that into the system. That's only going to continue if we can use HPMA as a conduit to actually encouraging these conversations. That I think it's going to be really helpful, and we will continue to try to do that. And finally, I'd just like to thank everybody who's is taking the time to attend today. And it's been 3 hours, but I think it's been a useful 3 hours. And thanks very much to you all for turning up and for staying in the conversation. And we look forward to seeing you at the next HPMA Future Focus event. So thank you very much, and goodbye. Have a good day.